Now, hello and welcome. I'm Ankit, and you're watching the Daily News Simplified. Now, in today's DNS, we'll try to simplify 7 important articles which are spread all over these 3 newspapers. But before moving forward, let me remind you to hit the like button, and also please do not forget to hit the subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with daily current affairs. So, with this, we move to the first article of the day, which you can see appeared in the Hindu newspaper. Now, this particular article, which is in op-ed section of the newspaper, it highlights the plight that people who are poor and they live in urban areas and the kind of difficulties they face in their life. Because today's article report that despite increasing incomes in the urban areas, people still face the persistent poverty and inequality. Further, despite higher wages in casual and self-employment, it does not lead necessarily to economic mobility of the people in urban areas. So this is the crux of the article. Now this particular news article, it is important from GS paper 1 and GS paper 2 syllabus. First of all, because GS paper 1 syllabus highlights poverty and developmental issues. Further, GS paper 2, it highlights welfare schemes for the vulnerable section of the population. So in this regard, the poor people who live in urban areas that are urban poor, they constitute a vulnerable section in the Indian society. Further, questions related to poverty, it has appeared in mains examination quite a few times. For example, this PYQ in the year 2018 asked us to define or elaborate on various provisions that have been given forward by the government, especially to eradicate poverty, and why it has not been able to achieve those targets. So in this regard, let me help you understand what is urban poverty with the help of an example. All of you must have seen this particular movie, that is Hera Fairy, and its sequel, that was Fir Hera Fairy. Now this story is about 3 people living in poverty in the city of Mumbai. Now these people, they do everything right from cutting corners to investing in duplicitous schemes and daydreaming in order to have a better standard of life. However, this movie describes this situation in a quite light-hearted manner. On the other hand, the situation, especially that of urban poor people in the country, is quite alarming. Because according to NSSO survey, there are almost 80 million urban poor people who live in India. So you can understand the number of urban poor who live in India is quite a huge number. Now let us understand what kind of vulnerabilities that these urban poor face in their day-to-day lives. And the first vulnerability is that of housing vulnerability. Because these vulnerable people or these poor people, they migrate from rural areas. So you can understand with increasing urbanization in India, it has led to increased number of migrants in the urban areas. Now these increasing number of migrants, they came to urban areas. However, in these urban areas, there are shortage of affordable housing units. So whenever there's a shortage of affordable housing units and in increasing demand of these affordable housing units due to increased migration, it creates a supply crunch in the market. So because of these two factors, that is increasing demand and decreasing supply, it has created the rise in cost of rent of these households as well as increase in property of residential complexes. So because of this increasing rent and property prices, it has made living in big cities an unaffordable exercise. So because of this increasing rent and increasing unaffordability, poor people in urban areas, they are forced to live in what are known as slums. Because these slums, they are housing projects which are made on temporary units. So because these urban poor people, they are forced to live in slums, it creates two challenges. First of all, that these slums, they do not give ownership right to these migrants. Further, these slums, they are void or they are devoid of even basic facilities. So these two challenges, the urban poor people in our country, they face, that they live in slums which are devoid of any basic facilities. Further, these slums, they also do not give the ownership rights to poor people in the urban areas. Now, let us understand what kind of economic vulnerabilities these poor people face. Now, most of these poor migrants who live in urban areas, they are forced to work in irregular as well as informal kind of a job. Now, these irregular and informal jobs, they pay irregular wages, which are further low in their amounts. Now, this low amount of wages, it is barely enables these poor people to have a subsistence kind of a living, and they cannot experience a good or better kind of a lifestyle. Further, these informal jobs, they do not provide these migrants with social security net also. So in terms of crisis, these poor people, they do not have an option to fall back towards some kind of an income security provisions. Understood? So poor people who live in urban areas, they face economic vulnerability as well because of their irregular and casual nature of their jobs, which gives them low amount of pay, as well as it does not provide them with any sort of social security provisions. Understood? So let us now understand what kind of social vulnerabilities these urban poor people face. Now, as you can understand, as these urban poor people, they get low amount of wages and salaries, it increases the divergence between the upper class and the lower class of the Indian urban areas. So this creates divergence, hence increasing the amount of income inequality in the country. So you can understand that low amount of wages, it increases the inequality between the prosperous and the not so prosperous class in the Indian society, thereby creating what you can call a social divide. Now this lower amount of wages, it also forces these poor people to spend less on their educational as well as their health needs. So this forces these poor people into entering into what is called a vicious cycle, because first of all they earn less amount of money, which forces them to spend less on educational and healthcare opportunities, which in a way reduces their human capital, thereby denying them the opportunity to get better jobs in the future. So this is what a vicious cycle that an urban poor people in the country are under currently. Now let me elaborate on this kind of vicious cycle with the help of this particular chart. Now as that I've already highlighted, poor people living in urban areas, they have low income. Hence, this low income forces them to spend less on their educational and healthcare developments. Thereby, people who spend less on their educational and healthcare development, they have low levels of human capital, that is low amount of educational degree, less skill training. Thereby, these people, they are involved in kind of a jobs which are low productive in nature, and hence this kind of a jobs, they also offer these people low income opportunities. So this is the social vicious cycle that a urban poor people is currently facing with. Further, this also culminates into what is called an economic vicious cycle, because as you can understand, an urban poor person, he or she, they just have a low levels of income, thereby they cannot save much of their incomes to invest in future. Thereby, urban poor people, they have low investment propensity, which leads them to low economic growth in the future. Thereby, this low economic growth, it forces these people to be employed in jobs which offer them lower income as well. So you can understand not just a social vicious cycle, but these poor people, they are also under what is known as a economically vicious cycle. So this is what the urban poor people are subjected with, and what kind of vicious cycle they are under throughout their own life. Now in this regard, let us take a look at some of the few suggestions that can increase or that can make the life of urban poor people in our country somewhat better. Now, in this regard, the government, it also recognized the huge amount of poor people living in urban areas, and thereby the government has brought forward many schemes in order to make the lives of urban poor people somewhat better. The most important scheme in this regard is PM Awas Yojana and its urban component. Because this kind of scheme that is brought forward by union government, it provides these poor people with what is called housing security. Because this scheme, it intends to construct affordable housing residential complexes in India's urban areas. So when poor people they have access to affordable housing units, then they'll not be forced to live in slum areas. Thereby, it will make the lives somewhat better. Further, these poor migrants they are also subjected to lack of food security. And in this regard, the government brought forward one nation, one ration card. And this card, it provides what is called the portability benefits to the beneficiaries of National Food Securities Act. Because any migrant, if he separates from his family, then he or she, they can access to their quota of food products from nearest one-stop centers through this one nation, one ration card. And alternatively, their families can also access in their residential home places using this very particular card. So you can understand it provides migrants or urban poor peoples with food security. Further, the government is also looking to provide income security to urban poor people. And in this regard, PM Swanidhi project or PM Swanidhi schemes, which provides these urban poor people area with working capital loans of up to rupees 10,000 rupees. Further, Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana and its National Urban Livelihood Mission, it also provides these people with kind of a working loans in order to make their lives somewhat better. So these two schemes, they are looking forward to provide these poor people with income security. Further, as I've already highlighted that these poor people who live in urban areas, they have or they do not have access to any kind of social security measures. So in this regard, the government, it has provided these people with somewhat a kind of a social security net through PM Shram Yogi Mandhan as well as Atal Pension Yojana. Because these are provided to people who are working in unorganized sector in the country. So you can understand this provides poor people in India with social security. So through government measures, government wants to take care of their housing security, food security, income security, as well as social security. So in this regard, let us take a look at some important measures that should be taken in near future in order to make the lives of poor people living in urban areas somewhat better. And in this regard, the first suggestion, it is meant to reduce the vulnerability of poor people living in urban areas. And in this regard, there are three important steps that should be undertaken. First is to ensure robust, equitable and sustainable access to healthcare services in urban areas. Further, these poor people, they should be provided with educational opportunity also so as to increase the levels of their human capital. Further, these vulnerable people, they should also be provided with what is called a social security net. So all these three measures, that are healthcare services access, educational opportunity, as well as access to social security, will help reduce the vulnerability of poor people in the country. Further, there is also an inherent need to introduce what is known as database that should contain details of urban poor people as well as migrant workers. And this database can be used to map the skill levels of these poor people living in urban areas, as the mapping of their skills will enable the policy makers to draft adequate policies. Further, there's also an inherent need to improve the levels of urban governance in the country, And in this regard, there are two important steps. The first is to decentralize the urban growth in the country, because currently there's a lot of burden on the metropolitan cities of the country, and this has created what is called an overcrowding in these cities, because more and more migrant peoples, they are moving from rural areas to these metropolitan towns, and this has created all sorts of problems like traffic congestion, lack of adequate housing levels, as well as lack of water and sanitation facilities. So in this regard, there's a need to decentralize urban growth in the country, as like tier 2 towns as well as tier 3 and 4 towns, they can also be developed into sprawling urban areas. So this will reduce the burden on the metropolitan cities in general. Further, there is also a need to strengthen the urban local bodies in the country by giving them more powers, as well as providing them with adequate level of financing facilities, because only when they have greater powers and increase amount of finances, they'll have a better governance system in the country. So these were all the discussions that were involved in what kind of problems that the urban poor face in the country, and what kind of measures that should be taken by the government in order to lessen these problems for urban poor people in the country. So with this discussion, we can only hope that poor people who live in urban areas like Raju in Hera Fairy can get rich someday. Although Raju was able to get rich only for a short period of time, we will sincerely hope that urban poor people who live in urban areas, they get a better standard of their lives. So with this, we move to the second article of the day, which also appeared in the text and context section of the Hindu newspaper. Now this article highlights the dispute between Kerala government on one hand, who wants more and more amount of borrowings in order to have greater amount of spending for social as well as developmental services. Whereas on the other hand, the central government is of the opinion that the state government should borrow only up till a certain limit, because the constitution under article 293, it wants to control the limits by the state government, and this constitution, it gives this control to the central government. Whereas on the other hand, the parliament, it passed what is known as Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act of the year 2003. So you can understand both constitutional as well as statutory limits are there on state governments in order to limit the amount of borrowings by the state government. Now this development, it is important from GS paper 3 perspective, because borrowings by any government is a source of mobilization of resources for the government. Whereas on the other hand, the amount of what kind of borrowings and debt by the government, it falls under the provision of government budgeting. And these two heads are represented in the GS paper 3 syllabus. Further, the FRBM Act of the year 2003, it was also a subject of UPSC mains question in the year 2013. So you can understand this topic is important from mains perspective. Now let us understand the two sides of the argument. The first is, why should the state governments have a limited amount of borrowing? And the second arguments by the state government, that they have some kind of responsibilities towards their electorate. So they should be allowed to spend more and more amounts for developmental and social services need. So let us understand the first side of the argument, which wants to keep the amount of debt by the state government at a lower levels. And this is subscribed to by the central government currently, because in addition to this constitutional as well as statutory requirement of limiting the debt, there are also many other arguments which favor the limiting, or which favors the limiting the amount of debt by the state governments. Now let us explore these arguments. The first is that whenever there's increasing amount of loans by the state government, it increases the amount of interest payments that should be given for these loans. So you can understand, the more is the amount of interest burden on the states, the lesser will the states be able to spend on more productive expenditures like capital investment as well as creation of public services. So, this increased burden on interest will force the government to cut back its spending on more productive economic activities. Hence, the levels of loans should be limited so as to limit the amount of interest payments by the government. Further, as government takes more and more loans, so this increases the amount of interest burden, because as more amount of loan is taken by any government, then the future loans will be charged at a higher interest rates. So you can understand that increasing amount of loans by any government, it increases the cost of borrowing of the government in its relative manner. So in order to keep the cost of borrowing low, we should also limit the amount of debt with any government. Further, as you can understand, there's only a limited amount of capital available in the market, and both public sector, that is government and its units, and private sectors, they try to take these loans from the market. So naturally, whenever government borrows more from the market, it leaves out less amount of money for private sector to borrow. Thereby, this term is called crowding out of private investment, because as more and more amount of money is borrowed by the public sector, it leaves less amount of investment money for private sector. So in this way, it discourages the private investment in an economy, which is very much needed for India's economic growth. Understood? So this is the reason why government, they want to limit the amount of debts that they have or the amount of loans that they take from the market. Further, as the government takes more and more loans from the market, it means that government offers government securities to the lending institutions, that are banks. So more and more amount of loans that government take, it will increase the amount of government securities that these banks hold. Now these government securities, they offer less amount of interest income to banks as compared to commercial loans that banks give. So you can understand, if banks borrow more amount of government securities from the market, it will reduce the amount of interest income that they get, thereby creating a situation which is known as fiscal repression of banks. So this is a situation that banks, they do not want to take more and more amount of government securities. Understood? Now also, increased borrowings by the government, it increases the money supply in an economy. Now naturally, as you may understand, increasing money supply in economy will also create pressures on the inflation levels in the economy. Thereby, the government should look to borrow less amount of money if it wants to control inflation in its domestic territory. Now, if any sovereign entity, be it union government or state government, it takes more and more amount of loans from the market, it downgrades their credit rating, because any credit rating will feel that this sovereign entity has become more vulnerable. So this downgrading of rating will decrease the confidence of people that they have in any government entity, thereby promoting the outflow of money from India. So this in a way will reduce the amount of foreign institutional investment as well as foreign direct investment that India gets in long term. So these are the reasons that reducing the amount of interest burden, keeping the cost of borrowing low, preventing the crowding out of private investment, preventing fiscal repression of banks, reducing the inflationary pressures on the economy, as well as prevention of downgrading of credit ratings are the reason why is there a need to keep the amount of debt low in the economy. Now let us understand the second side of this argument, that is argument given by the state governments in general. Now state governments, they have different kind of spendings as per their constitutional and their political responsibility, and these can be divided into social services expenditure as well as expenditures made on developmental services. Now in recent times, the social services expenditures by state governments, they have increased quite a large amount. For example, in the year 2022 and 23, the union government it spent about 2230 billion rupees on social services expenditure. Whereas on the other hand, in the same year, the amount spent by the state governments, it was close to 19,182 billion rupees, which you can understand is about 8.6 times more than the union government. So you can understand the amount of social services spending by the state government, it is many times more than the union government. And these spendings, they are made on the different kind of heads. For example, a state government employs healthcare professionals, teachers. So it has to provide salaries to them as well as enable the functioning of day-to-day schools and medical institutions. So for this, the state government provides with salaries and day-to-day expenses which constitute spendings under social services. Further, as you can understand, India's demography it is witnessing a quite a lot significant changes because with improvements in healthcare, we have witnessed increase in life expectancy in India, which has also increased the amount of senior citizens who are living in the country. So because of this, the government's pension outgo for retired officials as well as people who constitute marginalized section, it has also increased in the recent past. So this is what pension outgo is all about, and it constitutes increased amount of social services in any state. So because of these factors in total, the amount of social services by states have increased in the recent past, and it is 8.6 times more than that of union government. Now let us understand what are developmental expenditures made by the state governments in general. Now the state governments it spends quite a lot of amount of money on agriculture sector as well as promoting the industrial growth in their respective states. Now all these kind of measures that are subsidies, benefits extended to industry, they constitute developmental expenditures. So this developmental expenditure in the year 2005, it constituted of all states combined, it constituted 8.8% of India's GDP. Now this has increased in the year 2021 to 22 to 12.5% of India's GDP. So this developmental expenditure, as you can see, has increased in the recent past. And under this developmental expenditure, state government devolves increasing finances to local government, which promotes decentralized democracy. As well as state government, it is also looking to spend more on higher education and research, which in a way promotes increasing human capital in any state. So according to today's article, states it has responsibilities with respect to social services as well as developmental expenditures, which should enable these state governments to increase the amount of borrowings they take from the market. So we have to understand that there are two sides of the argument, that is one by the union government, which wants to limit the borrowings by the state government, and on the other side we have arguments by state government who wants somewhat liberal borrowing limits. So this is what the crux of today's text and context article is all about. Now closely associated with the last article is next article, which also appeared in the Hindu newspaper. Now this article it demonstrates the issue or conflict between Kerala government on one hand and union government on the other hand. Now whenever there is a dispute between two parties and one party takes some step, it in English is termed as the ball is in the next court or the ball is in your court. But in this regard, the ball is with the Supreme Court, because this dispute was referred to the Kerala government, and this dispute was referred by the Kerala government to the Supreme Court, and in this regard the Supreme Court has constituted a constitutional bench to decide upon this matter. Now, this particular news article, it highlights two important provisions. The first is the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act of the year 2003, which have been covered quite recently in the DNS. However, this article also refers to Article 293 of the Constitution. Now, this is an important article which limits the borrowing power of the state government. So, we'll be discussing this article and we'll be elaborating upon what is Article 293. Now, this is a significant provision in the Indian Constitution. Thereby, this article is important from GS Paper 2 syllabus. Further, as you can understand, questions related to borrowing powers of the government and its regulation by the parliament in form of Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act has been a subject of UPSC's question in the year 2018 in the prelims. So you can understand, as I've highlighted in the last article, this particular news article is important from both prelims as well as mains perspective. So let us now solve the practice question first. Consider the following statements. The first statement of this practice question, which was picked from pre-parikshan test, highlights the need to test a candidate in a moderated setting. So any candidate who has not given a mock test yet, please make sure to give a mock test in a setting which allows you to explore what can be going wrong in an exam and what can you benefit out of such proctored tests. So let us understand what this practice question is all about. The first statement, the center, it can impose restrictions on state borrowing limits if there is any outstanding loan which is pending with the central government. Now, this is a correct statement which you can see from Article 293 subsection 3 of this snapshot. Now, this is a snapshot of Constitution of India that I have attached, and let us explore Article 293 and its subsection 3. Now it states in verbatim, a state will not without the consent of Government of India can raise any loan if there is a still outstanding any part of the loan which have been made to the state by the Government of India. So in a way, Article 290 and its subsection 3, it gives the power to the union government to restrict the state government from borrowing more amount of money if the state government has any outstanding loan pending of the union government. So this first statement is a correct statement. Let us now understand the second statement. While there is a ceiling fixed on the guarantees given by the center, there is no such limits on the guarantees made by the state. Now this is an incorrect statement and let me explain you how. Now Article 292, it highlights that the powers of the union government to borrow money and give guarantees, it is subjected to limits which is fixed by parliament through passage of a law. Similarly, if you look the subsection 2 of Article 293, there also it highlights that the power of any state government to take loans, it is also within the limits of law which is passed by the parliament. So both the central government as well as state government, their ability to give guarantees on their loan, it is fixed under a ceiling which is made by a parliament through passage of a law. So thereby the second part of the second statement, that is there is no such limits to guarantees which is made by the state, it is an incorrect statement. So from this discussion, we can safely conclude that option A is the right answer because only one statement was correct. Now let us understand this second article which appeared also in the Hindu newspaper. Now this article, it reports that the Indian government, it is planning to constitute the second phase of strategic petroleum reserves in the country. Now the arm, that is India Strategic Petroleum Reserves Limited, it is looking forward to bring the private sector participation in operations of the India Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Now attempts to bring India's energy security, it is important from GS paper 3 syllabus because the syllabus highlights infrastructure with respect to energy. Further, developments in India's energy sector has been a keen area of interest for UPSC as far as prelims are concerned. For example, this PYQ of the year 2016, it was on the concept of net metering, which was in use back then. So in this regard, let us discuss what is India's strategic petroleum reserves is all about. Now, this strategic petroleum reserves, they are intent to boost India's energy security. Because first of all, India imports 85% of its crude oil requirements from other countries. So this means that India's energy, it is subjected to vulnerability as far as prices of crude oil is concerned. So in this regard, India recently constructed some strategic petroleum reserves, which are underground caverns, which are meant to store the crude oil in the country. And this crude oil, they can be utilized by the government in times of crisis situations. So this setting up of strategic storage units have been undertaken in two phases. The first phase, which was completed, and it is located in three locations, that is Visakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, Mangalore in the state of Karnataka, as well as Padur, which is also located in the state of Karnataka. Now this phase 2, which will be implemented again by the Indian Strategic Petroleum Reserves Limited, and it will be developed with the help of public-private partnership. So this second phase will be undertaken again in Padur, which is in Karnataka, as well as Chandikhol, which is in the state of Odisha. Now this phase 1, it gave India the energy security, or it provided India with the ability to store as much as crude oil, which is can be utilized by India for 9.5 days. Understood. Now let us consider the practice question. Consider the following statements regarding strategic petroleum reserves in India. First statement, currently India has the strategic petroleum reserve capacity of 90 days. Now again this statement is incorrect, because after phase 1, India has the strategic capacity to store crude oil for 9.5 days of its requirement. Now the second statement, India's first privately owned strategic petroleum reserves is in Mangalore, which again is an incorrect statement, because as the news highlights, the India's first private owned strategic petroleum reserve will be located in Padur and not in the city of Mangalore. Now the third news article, Maharashtra, it accounts for India's largest strategic petroleum reserve capacity. Now again this statement itself is incorrect, because you can understand there is no strategic petroleum storage units in the state of Maharashtra. Thereby this statement is also incorrect. So from the above discussion, as all these three statements are incorrect, thereby option D, that is none, is the correct answer. Now let us move to another article which you can see appeared in the Indian Express explained section. Now this news article, it highlights that only yesterday there was this earthquake incident in the country of Taiwan. Now this earthquake incident was in news because Taiwan is located in what is called Pacific Ring of Fire. Now this Pacific Ring of Fire is a location which is in Pacific Ocean, and this location, it is very much vulnerable as far as volcanic and earthquake activities are concerned. Now questions related to earthquake was asked in the prelims of the year 2023 itself. Further, this topic is important from GS paper 1 syllabus, because the syllabus, it highlights important geophysical phenomena such as earthquake. So this news article, it is important from prelims perspective. Now let us understand why is there increased or more amount of volcanic as well as earthquake based activities in the Pacific Rings of Fire. Because this area, it witnesses as much as 75% of world's total volcanoes. Now there has to be some logic, right? Let us understand that logic in the next slide. Now as you can see from this image, this Pacific Ring of Fire, it is located in a particular place in the globe where there are many major and minor tectonic plates. Now, these tectonic plates, when they interact with each other, it leads to a process called subduction. Because whenever two important major tectonic plates they interact, the heavier of these two plates, it subsides or it undertakes the process called subduction, or it moves to the mantle of the earth surface. Now, whenever this uh, tectonic plate it reaches earth's mantle, there's increased amount of temperature in earth's mantle which melts the tectonic plates, and it results into eruption of what is called magma. Now when this magma it reaches earth's atmosphere, it emerges out of earth's surface in a form of volcanoes. So you can understand this increased volcanic activity around the Pacific Ring of Fire, because this Pacific Ring of Fire it witnesses interaction between many major plates as well as some minor plates as well. Now let us solve the practice question with this information. With reference to Pacific Ring of Fire, consider the following statements. The first statement, it is a horseshoe shaped belt with chain of more than 450 active volcanoes. Now this is a correct statement because as you can understand, this Pacific Ring of Fire it is shaped in a form of horseshoe. Further, the volcanoes in Indonesia they are formed due to subduction zones where Eurasian plate, Pacific plate as well as Indo-Australian plate converge. Now it is quite clear from this image that Indo-Australian plate, Eurasian plate as well as Pacific plate they interact with each other in this particular area which is quite near to the country of Indonesia. So because of this there are many volcanoes that are Mount Merapi, Mount Krakatau which is located in the Indonesia territory. So second statement also is correct. The third statement, USA, Guatemala and Mexico are among important countries located in the Ring of Fire, which again is a correct statement because this Ring of Fire it extends in the west to US, Mexico as well as Guatemala. So from this above discussion I can safely conclude that option C is the right answer because all these three statements were correct. Now let us move to another article which also appeared in the Indian Express newspaper. Now this article highlights that India, although it has become world's fifth largest economy in terms of nominal GDP, in terms of per capita GDP, country is quite behind from its peer developing countries. Now this topic it is important from GS paper 3 syllabus because the syllabus highlights Indian economy and issues relating to growth and development. So this article highlights that economic growth or increased economic growth it does not automatically leads to economic development in the country because India has a large amount of population. Now questions related to how to calculate India's GDP and what is India's position among the other countries in the world, it has been asked by UPSC before, particularly in the year 2019. So this is an important topic as far as prelims are concerned. Now let us first understand what is gross domestic product. Now this gross domestic products, it is sum total of final value of goods and services which is manufactured or which is provided in the domestic territory of India. So all the goods and services, their final values they are added together, and the final value when adjusted for inflation it forms what is known as real GDP. Now in terms of absolute or real GDP, India stands among top 5 countries in the world, which you can understand from this graph. However, when you calculate India's real GDP and divide India's real GDP with its population, what we obtain is India's GDP per capita. Now, when you calculate India's GDP per capita, it is currently somewhere around $2,500. So in this regard, India, it is a middle income or lower middle income country. Now let us solve the practice question in this regard. With reference to classification of economies, which is done by World Bank, let us solve the following statements. The statement 1, as per the World Bank, India belongs to lower middle group country. Now this statement is correct because as per World Bank, India's GNI, it is approximately $2,390, which makes India a lower middle income country. Now the second statement, the World Bank, it classifies world economies based on GDP per capita at nominal exchange rate. Now this statement is incorrect because World Bank, it estimates the size of economy based on gross national income per capita. Now this gross national income, it is quite different from that of GDP. Because I've already highlighted GDP is sum total of final value of goods and services which is formed or manufactured in the domestic territory of India. But when you calculate gross national income, it means the total income of citizens of any country, be it inside India's territory or outside India's territory. Now, India's GNI as per World Bank last year was $2,390. So this means India currently is under lower middle income country. However, World Bank, as I've already highlighted, it classifies economy based on their GNI per capita, that is gross national income per capita. So based on this information, the correct answer to this model question is option C, as statement 2 was incorrect and statement 1 was correct. So let us move to the final article of the day, which we have picked up from the Business Line newspaper. Now this news article, it highlights that government has allowed export of 1000 tons of Kala Namak rice, which is a variety of rice grown in the state of Uttar Pradesh. Now this Kala Namak rice is a rice which has been given a name because of its black husk. However, the rice itself is not black, so don't worry. Now, as rice is a major crop in GS paper 3 syllabus, so you can understand this is an important part of GS paper 3 syllabus. Further questions related to India's National Nutrition Mission, it has been asked by UPSC before. Now, this rice, it has particular nutritional properties which we'll look into in the next slide. Now, let us understand what is this Kala Namak rice. Now, this is a rice which is grown in the Terai regions of Uttar Pradesh, particularly in 11 districts, which include Siddharthnagar, Gorakhpur, Basti, as well as other districts. Now, it is a scented rice variety which is available in the market for a price more than the average rice price. So this kind of a rice, it is in high demand because of its scented aroma as well as improved taste. Further, this kind of a rice has been cultivated in India since Buddhist period. So you can understand no other colonizers, they had not brought this kind of rice, and it is particularly an indigenous variety of rice. Further, this rice has been included in the specialty rices of the world by the Food and Agricultural Organization, which functioned under the United Nations. Also, the government of India, it provided GI tag to this kind of rice in the year 2012 itself. Further, as I've already highlighted, this kind of rice, it has some kind of a nutritional value. Because as you can see from this table, in terms of protein, this kind of rice has almost twice the amount of protein when you compare it with general rice. Further, in terms of iron as well as zinc, this kind of rice, it also has higher amount of iron, which helps development of folic acid as well as micronutrient, that is zinc. However, the most important part of this rice, or the most important nutritional value of this rice, is that it has a low glycemic index. So this kind of a rice is beneficial for people who have high diabetes, because otherwise these people, they refrain from eating rice However, they can eat a kala namak rice because it has low glycemic index. Understood? So, based on this information, let us now solve the practice question. The first statement, with reference to kala namak rice, consider the following statements. The first statement, it is mainly grown in the Terai region of the West Bengal, which is an incorrect statement because it is grown in the Terai region of Uttar Pradesh. The second statement, this kind of a variety of rice was introduced by Portuguese in India. Now, this is also an incorrect statement because this kind of rice was cultivated in India long before the Portuguese has arrived, and it has been cultivated since the Buddhist period, which is 6000 before Christ. Further, this kind of rice, it is rich in micronutrients like zinc and iron, which is a correct statement because as I have already highlighted, this kala namak rice is rich in protein, iron, zinc, as well as has a low glycemic index. Understood. So, based on this discussion, the correct answer to this model question or practice question is option A, as only third statement was correct. So, with this, I conclude our today's session of Daily News Simplified. And with this, I also wish you a very good night.